They came down through the skin of the sky on a night when the stars went dark one by one, like candles being pinched out by an enormous and indifferent hand. Sergeant Dara Vasquez was the first to see them. She was standing outside the Forward Research Station on the Karakoram Plateau, 3 miles above sea level and 4,000 miles from home, doing what she always did when she couldn't sleep, counting stars and failing to feel small. She had the habit from her grandfather, who had been a fisherman and who believed that the act of counting stars was the one human gesture that God recognized as prayer. She had never been religious herself, but she kept the habit because it reminded her of him, and because it was hers. The stars went dark from west to east, not shooting, not moving, just gone the way a light goes when someone switches it off in an empty room. She counted 17 missing before she understood what she was looking at. She hit the alarm before she finished the thought. The thing that landed in the valley below the station was not a ship in any conventional sense. It was more like a decision, a compression of intention into physical form. It settled into the rock face with a sound like the whole mountain exhaling, and it left no crater, no scorch mark, no wreckage of entry. It simply arrived, and then it simply was there, and the rock around it seemed to draw back, the way skin draws back from a brand. Vasquez watched from the ridge for 11 seconds. She counted those too. She was a counter. It steadied her. Inside the station, the science team was already half awake. Lieutenant Priya Okafor had been running blood panel analyses on altitude-adjusted samples. Was the kind of work you did in the small hours, when the instruments were quieter. She had the sharpest reflexes of anyone Vasquez had ever worked with, military or otherwise. The moment the alarm sounded, Okafor was in the corridor with her tablet, pulling acetylite feeds, her face lit blue and calm in the screen glow. Thermal signature is wrong, Okafor said, before Vasquez had even finished getting through the door. Whatever that thing is, it isn't warm. It's cold. Colder than ambient. She frowned, tilting the tablet. It's draining heat from the environment, like a localized heat sink. Is that possible? I'm looking at it, so apparently yes. The 4-person garrison, Vasquez, Okafor, Corporal Teo Marchetti, and Specialist Anaya Ruiz, had 37 seconds to decide their response before the station's outer pressure seals recorded the first attempt at entry, not a breach, not a forcing. The seals simply began to fail, quietly and systematically, the way an old man's heart fails, without drama, without violence, one valve at a time. Teo Marchetti was 22 years old and had joined the Planetary Research Corps because he wanted to see new things. He was from Genoa, the son of a pharmacist, and he had the particular bravery of young men who have not yet learned what fear tastes like, in the back of the throat. He grabbed the sample cases, 2 aluminum cases stenciled with biohazard warnings, containing 6 months of blood work, and held them to his chest like they were his own organs. We leave those, Vasquez said. Priya needs them. We leave them and we move. Teo looked at Okafor. Okafor looked at the tablet. The seals were failing. Bring them, Okafor said quietly, and Vasquez accepted this because there was no time not to. They made the access tunnel in 90 seconds, which was good, because 93 seconds after the outer seals failed, the first of them came through. Vasquez saw it on the tunnel's rearview camera. She would spend a long time afterward trying to describe what she saw, and she would never quite get it right, because the language she had, the language anyone had, was built for things that were analogous to other things, and what she saw on the screen was not analogous to anything she had a word for. It was tall. It moved. Those 2 facts were almost all she could confirm with certainty. The rest of it, the way the light seemed to pool and curdle around it, the way the air in the station fogged at its edges, the way breath fogs in cold, the long articulated appendages that might have been arms or might have been something else entirely, slid out of her brain the moment she looked. Away from the screen, like a dream dissolving at the edge of sleep, she made herself look back. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. There were 4 of them. They moved through the station with methodical patience. They broke nothing. They touched nothing carelessly. They went to the laboratory first, and they stood at the workbenches the way a person stands when reading something written in a language they know. They're reading the equipment, Okafor said. She was watching the same feed on her tablet, her voice carrying the flat steadiness that Vasquez associated with her at her most frightened. "They're not taking it apart. They're reading it." "Reading what?" "The experiments, the blood work." "I don't. I think they understand what we were doing here." Ruiz, barely spoken since the alarm, said, "Why does that matter?" Okafor was quiet for a moment. In the feed, one of the four had picked up a sample centrifuge and was holding it with the careful, possessive attention of someone who has found a thing they thought only they knew about. "Because," Okafor said, "what we were doing here was exactly what they've been doing. For a very long time. No one had told them that. It wasn't in any briefing, any classified file, any of the contact protocols that had been developed over the past decade and never used. No one had told them that the blood panel research at Station 7, altitude-adjusted cellular regeneration, the mechanism by which the human body reconstitutes itself under extreme physiological stress, was not a new field of human inquiry. No one had told them because no one knew. But Okafor had her data, and Okafor had her instincts, and Okafor had been staring at those centrifuge results for 6 months. She knew what the patterns meant. The creatures in the stations were studying the same phenomenon from the other side. The difference that mattered, the difference that would take Vasquez the next 18 months to fully understand, was what they did with what they found. They reached the tunnel at 0347 hours. The emergency evac transport was a battered 6-wheel crawler that smelled like diesel and altitude sickness, and the protein bars that Marchetti had been stress-eating since he arrived 8 months ago. Vasquez got it started on the 3rd try. The engine caught with a cough that echoed off the rock walls like a reprimand. For a moment she sat in the driver's seat, with her hands on the wheel, and her forehead against the vibrating windshield, and breathed. "Go," Okafor said. She was in the back with the sample cases. She had the tablet, and she was still watching the feeds. "Are they following?" "Not yet. They're still in the lab." Vasquez drove. The plateau road was not a road in any civilian sense. It was a track in the rock, carved by glacier and maintained by the resentment of engineers who had never wanted to be here. In daylight, it was navigable. In the dark at speed, with her hands not quite steady, it was a declaration of intention against physics. She drove it the way her grandfather had navigated the Sea of Cortez, in a boat with a failing motor. Not by reading the terrain, but by feel, by the particular memory in her hands that had been laid down by 300 hours of this exact drive. She counted the switchbacks. 12 to the lower plateau, 11, 10. "They're moving," Okafor said. 9, 8, 7, Dara. 6, 5, Dara, they're fast. 4. She hit the 4th switchback at a speed that put the crawler on 2 wheels for a half-second, that felt like a geological epoch, and she heard the sample cases slide across the floor of the cargo bay, and she heard Teo make a sound that was not quite a word, and she straightened the vehicle and kept going. 3, 2, 1. The lower plateau opened up ahead of them like a breath. Flat rock, sparse scrub, faint gray line of the comms relay tower on the horizon. Vasquez put the crawler into its highest gear and aimed for the tower, and did not look. In the rear-view mirror, Okafor looked. "They stopped," she said after a moment. "At the top of the plateau road, they stopped. Why? I don't know. Pause. I think they're watching." Vasquez thought about that. She thought about the way they had moved through the station, touching nothing carelessly, breaking nothing. She thought about the centrifuge in those long articulated hands, held the way you held something you recognized. "They're not chasing us," she said. "No, they know where we're going." A longer silence. Outside, the gray light of pre-dawn was beginning to bleed into the eastern sky. The comms relay tower grew closer. Vasquez kept her hands steady on the wheel. "They already know where we are," Okafor said. "I think they've known for a while." The relay station was unmanned. A solar-powered installation the size of a small house, bristling with antennae and marked with the 3-language warning signs that meant, "Keep out, high voltage, authorized personnel only." Vasquez's credentials made her authorized personnel, which in practice meant she had the code for the lockbox on the door. Inside, she sent the distress burst, while Okafor set up a secondary transmission using the sample case's embedded biotelemetry transmitter. 40 minutes. Teo stood at the single small window and watched the plateau. She sat against the wall with her knees drawn up and her eyes closed, not sleeping. just waiting with the patience that Vasquez had always found remarkable in her. Ruiz was the youngest of them, 20 years old, a small town in the Atacama that had approximately 400 people and had produced, in the last decade, planetary researchers and one opera singer. She had once told Vasquez, "In the way people tell you things when they are very tired, and the altitude makes the truth feel lighter," that she had come here because she wanted to understand what it meant to be alive at the cellular level. She had been studying mitochondrial respiration under low oxygen conditions. She was very good at it. She was holding the second sample case in her lap. She had picked it up without being asked. "They'll come here too," Tio said from the window. He was not panicking. He was stating a fact. "Yes," Vasquez said. "So we need to be somewhere else. We need to transmit first. How long?" She looked at Okafor. Okafor held up 3 fingers. 3 minutes. They waited. The equipment hummed. Outside, the dawn came up, gray and cold and enormous. The kind of dawn that reminds you how much of the earth is not people, is not buildings, is just stone and air and distance. Vasquez counted the antennae visible through the grimy porthole. 11. She counted the seconds. 180 of them. When Okafor said done, she already had the door open. They took the sample cases and they walked. There was no vehicle. The nearest settlement was 14 kilometers north, a mining operation that had a helipad and a satellite phone and, Vasquez hoped, someone with the sense to use them. She had been to the settlement twice. She knew the way. She started walking, and the others fell in behind her, and no one suggested an alternative, because there wasn't one. The thing about 14 kilometers at altitude is that it is not a distance problem. It is a time problem, and a breath problem, and eventually a belief problem. The belief that the next step is worth taking, that the legs will provide it. The horizon is not simply receding at the same speed you approach it. Vasquez had read, somewhere, that the Quechua-speaking peoples of the high Andes did not conceptualize the future as in front of them. They conceptualized it as behind them, because you cannot see it, and they put the past in front, because you can. She thought about that for the first 2 kilometers, which was the same amount of time it took for the feeling to return to her toes. Okafor talked while she walked. It was a habit, a way of processing, a mechanism. Vasquez had observed in her through 8 months of close quarters and learned to read. Okafor talked when she was working something out, and the more she talked, the more important the thing she was working out. "The blood work," Okafor said. "The regeneration study. You know what the core finding was. Cellular replenishment under hypoxic stress," Vasquez said. "The body rebuilds faster than normal. More than that. The body rebuilds differently. The markers we found, the regenerative proteins that only appear above 4,000 meters, don't exist at sea level. We'd never seen them before because we'd never looked for them in the right conditions." She paused for breath. The altitude required it. Those proteins are the mechanism by which the body rejuvenates itself at the cellular level. Not just repairs, rejuvenates. Given the right conditions, given the right catalyst, the process could theoretically continue indefinitely. Vasquez looked at her. Theoretically. We were 6 months in, we hadn't published. We hadn't confirmed anything. But the patterns. Okafor shook her head. "I've been staring at those patterns every night for 6 months. Those creatures understood what they meant in 30 seconds of looking at the equipment. Because they've been studying the same thing. Because they've been doing the same thing. To acquire those proteins. A beat. You understand what I'm saying?" Vasquez understood. She had understood in the tunnel, watching the creatures move through the lab with that terrible care, that terrible patience. She had understood the way you understand the punchline of a joke in the second before it lands. "They need human blood," she said. "They need the specific proteins produced by human blood under these exact conditions. Hypoxic stress, high altitude, extended duration. The body makes something under these conditions that their biology cannot manufacture. And it does for them exactly what it does for us. Regenerates at the cellular level. Keeps them alive. Keeps them young," Vasquez said. The words sat between them in the thin, cold air. They walked. At kilometer 7, Tio found a cached emergency supply kit under a cairn of rocks that turned out to contain water, a foil blanket, 2 protein bars, and a hand-crank flashlight. He distributed the water, without being asked and without keeping more for himself, which Vasquez noted. He ate half a protein bar and gave Ruiz the other half. Then he said, with the directness that she had come to associate with him, "They've been doing this to people before us." "Probably," Okafor said. "For how long? I don't know, a long time." "There are stories," Ruiz said. She had been quiet for so long that all three of them looked at her. She was walking steadily, the sample case in her right hand, eyes on the middle distance. In the Atacama, in the high villages, stories about people who disappeared, creatures who went up into the high country and didn't come back. There were always explanations: altitude sickness, falls, bad weather. But there were also the other stories, the ones the old women told. She paused. "My grandmother told one. A man who came from the sky," she said, "took young blood to keep himself alive. The priests said it was a devil. The scientists said it was folklore." Another pause. "I used to think it was both." No one said anything to that. The wind moved across the plateau with the flat, indifferent persistence of wind at altitude, which has no opinion about what it passes through. At kilometer 9, they saw the first one. It was standing on a ridge to the east, against the gray sky, at a distance Vasquez estimated at 400 meters. It was very still. It was watching them with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry, because hurrying is not a concept that applies to it. "Stop walking," Vasquez said. "They didn't stop. It's alone," Tio said. "Probably not," Vasquez said. "It wasn't." At kilometer 10, there was one on the ridge to the west. At kilometer 11, one appeared ahead of them, on the track itself, 300 meters distant, standing with that same unnerving stillness. They stopped, not because they panicked, but because the geometry of it required a moment of calculation. Vasquez looked at the one ahead. She looked at the two on the ridges. She looked at Okafor, who was looking at her tablet, where the biotelemetry from the sample cases was still transmitting. She looked at the sample cases. She looked at Ruiz, was holding her case with both hands now, her face calm, her eyes on the creature ahead of them. "They're not attacking," Tio said. "No," Vasquez said. "They could have. All night, they could have." "Yes, so they want something else." He looked at the cases. "They want the samples." "They want us," Okafor said. "The samples are just evidence. They want us." She put the tablet away. The transmission was still running. Whatever happened in the next minutes, the data was going out. "They want to know if we've understood. If we can be useful." Vasquez thought about the creature in the station, holding the centrifuge with that careful, possessive recognition. She thought about her grandfather's hands on the tiller of his boat, the particular confidence of a man who understood the thing he was working with. She thought about the 18 seconds she had spent watching the stars go dark. Then she set down her sample case, very deliberately, in the middle of the track. She stepped away from it. She waited until the others were watching her, and then she looked at the creature ahead of them. And she did something that no contact protocol had ever suggested, because no contact protocol had anticipated this particular geometry. She held up her hand, not a wave, not a greeting. The gesture you make when you want to show you are not holding a weapon, palm out, fingers spread, nothing hidden. She counted 1, 2, 3. The creature on the track moved toward them. Not fast, not slow. With the measured pace of something approaching a question it is not sure how to ask. It stopped 6 meters away. At this distance she could see it more clearly than the camera had allowed. It was approximately twice her height, she knew intellectually, but which still required a recalibration of everything her nervous system understood about scale. Its surface was not skin in any sense she recognized. It was more like a boundary, like the surface tension of water, place where one thing became another. Its face, if face was the right word, if there was a right word, was oriented toward her with the quality of attention she associated with experts listening to something in their field. Judgment, evaluation. It looked at her hand, it looked at her face, it looked at the sample cases on the ground between them, then it looked at Okafor. This was not random. The creature's attention moved to Okafor with a purposefulness that made Vasquez's skin prickle. It understood that Okafor was the one who had run the analysis. It had understood since the station, who among them had read the fears. Okafor stood very still. Then she said in the voice she used for data, "You've been here before." She was not asking, she was stating, the way she stated findings. The creature was still. Its stillness was not the stillness of incomprehension. It was the stillness of listening. You have a mechanism that requires a biological catalyst, Okafor said. A specific protein, acquiring it from human subjects who live at altitude. For a very long time. She paused. Her voice was steady. And you came here. Because our research identified the same protein. You thought we were further along than we are. You thought we could be made to be. Another pause. But you haven't taken us yet. You could have. You didn't. Which means you're not certain that taking us would work. The creature. Not toward them. A lateral movement, a repositioning of its attention, a shift in the way it was oriented. The two on the ridges were still. Vasquez thought about what Okafor was doing, and she thought about it fast, because there was not much time in which to think. Okafor was negotiating. Not with language because they did not share one, with logic. With the logic of observed behavior, of held action, of choosing not to act in ways you could have acted. With the logic that a creature studying the same phenomenon from the other side was, at some level, engaged in the same project. And she thought about her grandfather. He had fished the Sea of Cortez for 40 years, and in that time, he had encountered every variety of storm, every variety of danger, every variety of the unexpected. He had told her once that the secret was never to act as though you were afraid of the sea, not because the sea cared, the sea didn't care, but because the body that acts unafraid moves differently than the body that acts afraid, and in that difference is often the margin. He had not said this about courage, he had said it about physics. The sea responds to what you do, not what you feel. Vasquez thought about this. Then she said, "We can help each other." She said it aloud in English, knowing the creature did not speak English, knowing the words meant nothing. But the tone was a variable. The tone was data. She kept it level, factual, the tone of someone offering a transaction, not begging for mercy. The creature was still. "What you need," Vasquez said. "Produce naturally. We've been producing it for 200,000 years. You've been acquiring it, inefficiently, from individuals. But if you understood the mechanism, and if we understood the mechanism, and if we chose to..." She stopped. She was going too fast and she was talking to something that could not hear the words. She started again, slower. "We could figure this out, without anyone dying." She felt Tio looking at her. She felt Ruiz beside her holding the sample case with both hands. She felt Okafor to her left, very still, running calculations that Vasquez could not follow. The creature looked at the sample case again. Then it looked at Vasquez. Then it did something she had not expected. It crouched. A slow, deliberate lowering of that enormous frame to approximately her eye level. It was the posture of someone who wants to reduce the intimidation differential. She recognized it because she had used it herself, injured civilians, with frightened children, with anyone who needed the person in front of them to feel slightly less like a threat. It had learned this gesture. Or it had always known it. She could not tell which, and it did not matter. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." She picked up the sample case. She walked toward the creature, 6 meters, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. She set the case on the ground in front of it. Then she straightened up, and she met the orientation of its attention. Whatever passed for its gaze, and she held it. A long time passed. She counted the seconds. She lost count somewhere around 40 and let it go. It was not something she did often. Then the creature extended one of its long appendages, slowly, with the deliberate telegraphing of something that understood that slowness was communication, and opened the case. It looked at the samples, at the 6 months of blood panels, labeled and sorted and stored in their insulated trays. It looked at them the way it had looked at the centrifuge, with recognition, with the quality of seeing something you expected to find, and finding it exactly where you expected. Then it looked at Okafor, and it looked at Ruiz, and it looked at Vasquez, and it made a sound that was not a word but carried the weight of one. Okafor, later said she had no idea why she did this, said, "Yes." The creatures on the ridges came down, not aggressively, not fast. They came down the way professionals move toward a worksite, with purpose and without theater. They gathered around the open sample case, and they examined it, and they communicated with each other in whatever passed for their communication, the sound of which was like wind through narrow stone. and Vasquez stood among them in the growing dawn and breathed the thin cold air and did not move. Tio found her elbow with his hand. Just a touch. Just the fact of another person present. She was grateful for it, in a way she did not have language for. She did not know, in that moment, whether what she had done was going to work. That was the thing nobody who wrote about it later seemed to understand. The accounts described her gesture as confident, decisive, the act of a person who had read the situation correctly and acted on her reading. That was not how it had felt. It had felt like stepping out of a boat in deep water and trusting that the water would, against all evidence, hold her weight. She had set the case down because she had run out of other things to try, and because the alternative was to stand still and wait for whatever was going to happen to her instead of from her. There is a difference between those two, and the difference is small, and the difference is everything. The creature beside the open case made the sound again, the wind through narrow stone. The other three answered it, where they stood at the edges of the gathered group. And Vasquez understood. Without language, without translation, with the same animal pattern recognition that lets a person know when a room has gone wrong, before any words have been spoken, that something was being decided. She looked at Okafor. Okafor was watching the creatures with the absolute concentration she had learned to recognize as Okafor at work. There was no fear visible in her face. There was no calm there either. There was the third thing, the thing Vasquez had no name for, the state of being so completely inside a problem that the question of one's own survival became a variable in the problem, rather than a constraint. "Yeah," Vasquez said very quietly. "Wait. Are we wait?" So she waited. The wind moved across the plateau. The sun, when it finally cleared the eastern ridge, was the color of pale copper, and it fell across the gathered group and lit the creatures in a way that made them seem, for the first time, like things that existed in the same world she existed in. Things that cast shadows, that occupied space, that had to deal with the same morning that she had to deal with. The nearest of them straightened, slowly, telegraphing. It closed the sample case with what Vasquez would later realize was extraordinary care. The case had a tricky double latch that took most humans 3 tries to operate, and the creature did it in 1, which suggested either that it had been observing the case in detail or that it understood mechanisms in a way that translated across forms. It picked up the case. It held it the way Okafor had held the tablet the night before, as evidence, as something to be examined later, as a question that would require time to answer correctly. Then it set the case back down, 3 meters from where Vasquez stood. In the space between them, she understood. It was not taking the samples. It was returning them. The case was, for the moment, theirs again. The gesture was so specific, so clearly an offering rather than a confiscation, that she felt the back of her neck go cold in a way it had not gone cold for any of the threats of the night. It was not a threat. It was an opening. The breeze beside her made a small sound, half a laugh, half something else. "They want to talk," she said. "Yes, they actually want to talk." "Yes." Tio, who had said almost nothing for an hour, said, "Then we should probably get the radio working." It was such a Tio sentence that Vasquez nearly laughed, and she felt the laughter coming up in her throat with the dangerous lightness of post-adrenaline release. And she swallowed it. Because laughing in this moment seemed like a thing the creatures might not understand, and she did not want to test the limits of their patience this early. They got the radio working, or, more accurately, Okafor used the relay station's emergency channel to compose a message that was not the standard distress format, because the standard distress format would have brought a military response, and a military response was the worst possible outcome of the next 12 hours. She composed instead a research channel transmission, marked with the priority codes that meant urgent scientific contact, request immediate consultation, no hostile action indicated. She sent it 3 times, on 3 different bands, with the sample case's biotelemetry transmitter running in parallel as backup. The creatures watched her do this. They watched with the attention of researchers observing a colleague's technique, which was, Vasquez thought, exactly what they were. The lead creature, the one that had crouched, the one that had returned the case, moved closer to Okafor in slow increments, until it was standing perhaps 2 meters from her shoulder, watching her hands work the radio controls. Okafor noticed. She angled her body slightly to make the workings of the radio more visible. The creature absorbed this and did not move closer. When the message was sent, Okafor turned and looked at the creature directly. "Now we wait," she said. "It will take time. They will come carefully." Creature was still. Then it did something that none of them had been prepared for. It sat down. Not the slow, controlled crouch from before. A full lowering of itself to the ground, the long appendages folding underneath in a posture that read, cross whatever species barrier separated them as patients. It was telling them, "We will wait too." It took 11 days. The summit research team arrived by helicopter on day 2, 8 scientists and a communications specialist, with equipment that could actually handle the volumes of data they needed to exchange. What they found at the relay station was not what they had prepared for. It was better and stranger, a negotiation that had already begun, structured around the contents of 2 aluminum cases, and the particular stubbornness of a sergeant who counted stars. Protein was the common ground. Okafor had named it Altitude Regenerative Factor 7 in the initial paper, which was later universally abbreviated to ARF7, because no one wanted to say the full name in a briefing room. The creatures, who were later designated simply as the founders in the contact literature, because every attempt at a proper name collapsed under the weight of its own inadequacy, had been studying the same compound in human subjects for what the translators estimated at somewhere between 400 and 800 years. They had been doing it wrong, from their own perspective as much as anyone's. The extraction method was inefficient, the yield low, the mortality rate of the subjects total. It had never occurred to them to ask. This was not cruelty exactly. It was a failure of imagination of a specific kind. They had not considered that the subjects were doing anything worth asking about. They had considered human biology, but not human agency. It was, in this way, a mirror of every colonial medical atrocity in human history, which Okafor noted in her report in exactly those terms, and which the committee reviewing the report chose not to include in the summary document, and which Vasquez brought up at every subsequent briefing until it was included. The founders, for their part, underwent what the xenopsychologists described as a significant recalibration of their model of human beings. The evidence suggests they had assumed, over the centuries, that their subjects were not engaging in systematic inquiry. The discovery that humans had independently located ARF7 and were studying it through rigorous controlled methodology was, in their terms, what the translators rendered as approximately a development we did not anticipate from sources we had not assessed correctly, which was, Vasquez thought, a very elegant way to say they had been wrong. She was present for the first formal communication exchange. It happened on a portable platform on the plateau, surrounded by instruments and observers from 3 countries and 12 disciplines, under a sky that was very blue and very cold. The lead xenolinguist, a small, fierce woman named Dr. Alina Patel, had built the initial translation matrix in 9 days, which she later said was the best work of her life and also the most terrifying. The first question the founders asked, rendered through the matrix with approximate fidelity, was, "How long has your species known about this compound?" Okafor answered, 6 months in its current form, though our bodies have been producing it for 200,000 years. The founder's response registered as something the matrix translated as close to wonder, though Dr. Patel cautioned that wonder might be an overreach, that the founders had a limited repertoire of emotional states, and that the human concept of wonder might not map cleanly onto what they were experiencing. Vasquez, who had watched them crouch to her eye level in the pre-dawn dark of the plateau, thought Dr. Patel was probably right about the imprecision and probably wrong about the absence. There was a long negotiation. The details of it are not the point of this account. The point is what was exchanged and what was not. The founders knew things about ARF7 that the research team did not. They had been studying its effects for centuries, its behavior under different atmospheric conditions, its interactions with different biological systems, its theoretical ceiling, teat. They had developed refined elements to the extraction process that were 70 years ahead of anything the human scientists had. They wanted to share this knowledge because they understood, now, that the alternative was to continue a centuries-long process that was inefficient, ethically indefensible under the framework they were rapidly constructing. Also, and this was the part that the committee found most surprising, lonely. The xenopsychologists had not anticipated lonely. Port used different language, isolated, limited in available research partners, constrained in the development of the science. But Vasquez read the raw session transcripts, and the word the Matrix had generated first was lonely. And Dr. Patel had changed it before the transcript was formalized, and Vasquez thought she had been wrong too. What the humans brought was not just the biology, it was the methodology, the rigor, the insistence on replication, on falsifiability, on submitting your results to the scrutiny of people who would try to prove you wrong. The founders had been working in isolation for centuries, and isolation does to science what it does to everything. It produces a set of answers shaped by the questions one person thought to ask. Human science was loud and contentious and chaotic, and slow and wrong half the time, and it was the best instrument for finding true things that had ever been developed on this planet, or apparently anywhere else in the reachable vicinity. The founders wanted in. The exchange agreement took 11 months to finalize. The research collaboration that emerged from it produced 3 separate breakthroughs in cellular regeneration within the first 2 years, one of which led directly to the successful treatment of a class of degenerative neurological conditions that had been untreatable. The founders provided the theoretical framework, the humans provided the methodology, and, crucially, the willingness to be wrong in public. It was, Dr. Patel said at the first joint conference, the most productive scientific partnership in human history. Was a somewhat smaller boast than it appeared, given that the previous record holder had been a collaboration between 2 universities in the same city. Vasquez was at the conference. She was sitting in the 4th row, in her dress uniform, because Okafor had insisted on it, and because Okafor was almost always right about things that mattered. She was not thinking about the conference. She was thinking about her grandfather. He had told her once that the sea did not distinguish between people who deserved to survive and people who did not. The sea just was. What determined survival was preparation, attention, and the willingness to do the right thing in the moment when doing the right thing was hardest and most uncertain. She had put down the sample case. She had walked forward. That was all. That was the whole of it when she reduced it. A decision made in 4,000 meters of thin air, in the gray light before dawn, with nowhere to run and nothing to protect herself with except the evidence of her own species' curiosity. That curiosity, that was the thing. It was what Okafor had gambled on. Not that the founders were kind, not that they were merciful, not that they could be reasoned with in any conventional sense. That they were scientists. And scientists, whatever else they are motivated by the desire to know. And to know accurately. And to not be surprised by things they should have predicted. The humans had surprised them. The humans had been running the same experiment in the same conditions with no knowledge of the founders' centuries of prior work, and had arrived at ARF-7 independently. This was, in the founders' assessment, unlikely. Probability of independent convergence on this specific compound was vanishingly small. The more logical explanation, they had concluded, that human beings were more capable than they had assessed. They were correct. They had just been looking in the wrong place for the evidence. Ruiz published her doctoral thesis 14 months after the events on the plateau. It was titled, Mitochondrial Respiration and Regenerative Protein Expression in High-Altitude Human Populations, Implications for Extended Cellular Viability, which was not a title that would have set anyone's heart racing in a library, but which became, over the next decade, one of the most cited papers in the field of xenobiology. She dedicated it to her grandmother. The dedication read, The Old Women Who Knew the Stories First. Tio went back to Genoa. He came back 6 months later, because it turned out that participating in the most significant first contact event in human history did something to a person's relationship with their hometown. He joined the joint research team as a data analyst, and over the next 3 years, became the most effective communicator between the human team and the founder liaisonsimism, not because he had any particular linguistic gift, because he had the specific patience of someone who has carried the right thing through a tunnel in the dark and knows that the carrying matters, regardless of what happens next. Okafor became the youngest person ever appointed to the Joint Research Directorate. She did not sleep any more than she had before. She ran her analyses in the small hours when the instruments were quiet, and she still talked when she was working something out, and the talking was still a way of knowing when she had found something important. Vasquez went back to her post. There were other postings, other stations, other things that needed a person who could count and stay calm and make decisions in the moments when decisions were required. She made them. She kept the habit of counting stars, though there were fewer dark ones now. The founder's ships, once she knew what to look for, read as a kind of presence rather than an absence, the way a known face in a crowd reads differently than a stranger's. She never stopped counting. It steadied her. It was hers. She thought sometimes about the moment on the plateau, when the creature crouched to her eye level in the gray light, and she had understood the gesture. Not because she was trained for it, not because any protocol had prepared her for it, because she had used it herself for the same reason, in the same spirit, to reduce the distance between two things that were both, in their different ways, trying to understand what they were looking at. We called them monsters. For 800 years, we told stories about them in the high villages and the cold country. We built our fear around them into legends that had just enough truth in them to keep the fear alive and not enough truth to point anywhere useful. We named them devils and called it explanation. And all that time, taking in their own particular way, working their particular problem, they had been doing what we were doing, looking at the same question from opposite sides. Waiting, perhaps, though the psychologists cautioned against projecting this, for someone to down the thing they were carrying and walk forward with an open hand. That was the human touch, not the bravery, not the cleverness, the specific stubbornness of a species that looks at something it cannot understand and decides, on insufficient evidence, to try anyway, down the case, to take the 3 meters, to count to 40, and let the counting go. The stars do not go dark anymore. The founders move across the sky now, the lights stay on. She noticed this the first time it happened, standing outside a research station in another mountain range. Her hands around a mug of terrible instant coffee, her neck tilted back. The lights all stayed on, and she stood there looking at them, and she did not count. She just looked. It was a different kind of prayer. She thought her grandfather would have recognized it. The sea responds to what you do. She went back inside. There was work.